Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Oceanic. Today I'm just going to continue where I left off with the skin tone glazing. I'm starting with the light side right now. I'm going to work some flesh tone highlight glaze, very thin glaze, over her right side. Then if there's enough time, I've got some light gray blue and some deeper gray blue mixed up to turn these sort of shapes into sort of cloudish forms.
So,
and yes,
it is not that you will not have days like that. You will have days like that. I've had days like that. And on those days I wondered, what's wrong with everybody today? How come everybody today is so uptight? They're uptight because I have to be the doctor with all the power in my hand to give them or not give them their prescription. And I'm triggering in them their worst fears of authority figures just by not showing up that day. Never mind that I've been a good physician to them for a year, but today I'm being somebody who's maybe dangerous. In other words, the most important work and then there's one more thing I want to say to you. Anybody who's drawn into addiction work, like me, that includes everybody in this room. Whatever motives that you think you have, whether they're to help people, to alleviate suffering, that's all great and it's all genuine and true. But underneath it all, there's something else as well, which is that you got your own stuff. There's something about the energy of these people that draws you like a magnet, because it's within you as well. And so that the most important work you're ever going to do in this field is with yourself. Because if people were hurt in relationship in the first place, it means they're going to heal in relationship. And you're an important part of their world. So if we're going to give them a healing of relationships in which they have a chance to drop their defenses against vulnerability, drop their hardness, and open up and feel what's underneath all that, they're going to have to feel very safe with you. And to feel safe with you, you need to be real aware of what you're carrying yourself and how you're managing yourself. And that means doing that internal work and looking after yourself as well. All right, there's a question right here, but where's the mic now? Mics? They're right here, please. Thank you. By the way, Denise, are you around? What time is the session finished?
Right about now. Let's have this be the last question.
Okay, sure, thank you. All right.
Thank you for being there and the work you do. We're talking a lot about individual and
Can
family.
you speak to the mic?
Yes, sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
So we're talking a lot about individual and family trauma, but trauma is so much bigger than that. How do we start talking about the social traumas and acknowledging the fact that the very systems put in place to deal with these things are based in racism and sexism and oppression, and what do we do about that? We can't solve, we can keep tackling an endless stream of these individual traumas, but what about the bigger social pieces?
Yeah. Well, look, in your last election, you had two traumatized candidates. Not one, two. The one I already talked about with the narcissism, the grandiosity, the sense of inferiority that he is to saying how great he is all the time, and his ADHD. Absolute classic cases. And I mentioned his trauma. Your other candidate had pneumonia, and she didn't tell anybody. She nearly collapsed. In fact, she was collapsing and had to be caught up by her Secret Service people and supported. And that was thought to be an act of bravery and self-sacrifice. No. It was the act of a desperately driven person. How do we know? Because at the Democratic Convention, when she was nominated, there was a film, a video played of her life, narrated by Morgan Freeman. The back to it. Anybody hear that one? Side? Well, a little vignette that's absolutely telling and essential to understand that personality. 4-year-old Hillary, and this story comes from her, runs into her home where she's frightened and upset because neighborhood kids are threatening and bullying her. 4 years old. And her mom says, "There are no room for cowards in this house. Now you get out there and figure out what to do about those kids." And this is presented as a wonderful example of character building. And this is watched by a whole nation. I've seen nobody comment on it. Nobody commented on this. What is the actual message to the 4-year-old? There's no room for your vulnerability in this house. You're on your own. You got a problem, suck it up. Develop this persona behind you, which you hide your vulnerability. So you had 2 traumatized candidates. What kind of a society throws up 2 traumatized candidates to vie for the absolute leadership of that society? A society in which trauma is as common as apple pie. In which people are totally disconnected from their gut feelings. Like, again, I'm not talking about politics, particularly. I'm not talking about policies. I'm not telling you who you should vote for. I'm talking about the human dynamics here. Donald Trump said the other day that I won the popular vote. It's only that millions of illegal immigrants voted illicitly, and that's why it didn't show up in the actual vote count. Everybody accused him of lying. He was not lying. He believes it. It's too stupid a lie to tell if you know it's not to be true. He's not that stupid. He actually believes it. Why? Because he's so hurt that he cannot abide the possibility that people don't like him. If you're in touch with your gut feelings, you will know that there's something not right here. But the essence of trauma is disconnection from ourselves, including from our gut feelings. I'll be saying more about that this afternoon. So, what you're talking about is a society in which racism and you know, the articles, you know, the New York Times, last 3 days, black women with cervical cancer, much higher chance of dying from it. Black men much more likely to have high blood pressure in this society.
Let's take some.
And the politics and the emotional unintelligence of people is all a reflection of trauma. And I don't have an answer for you. The only thing I can tell you is to ask you, when you ask your question, how do you feel about what you said?
I mean,
What
I feel a lot of things. I think I feel overwhelmed. I think I feel...
Okay, overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by a problem that's too big for you, is that it?
Overwhelmed by a... Yeah, kind of.
Okay, let me ask you a question. If you tap into that sense of overwhelm internally, if you drop the particular subject on which it's crystallizing right now, but just tap into the sense of overwhelm, how new is that to you?
Not very.
How far does it go back?
I don't know that I have a memory that doesn't include and incorporate
Exactly.
that.
Exactly. In other words, you're still living out of a childhood dynamic. Okay, and from that position, you ain't going to do anything about the society. So I don't know what to tell you what to do. I do what I do, you can do what you do. I have political points of view, I do what, you know. But as long as we're coming from that childhood overwhelm, we can't do anything. And when you no longer come from that, you'll figure out what to do. You might not be able to change the whole thing all by yourself, but you'll be very active, you'll be very effective in what you do. It's not up to you. You can't change the world. You can, however, do what you can to effect change, but to do so effectively, you have to deal with where you're coming from. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's not a criticism of you. It's just I'm saying that in order to even answer your own question, you're going to have to deal with this chronic overwhelm that goes back way before you were aware of politics. Fair enough?
Fair.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you in an hour. All right, so this afternoon's talk, I'm switching gears somewhat, although you see very much that I'm still dealing with phenomena that arise for similar reasons. They just, you know what I said, that it all goes back to childhood experience and childhood trauma. And I'm going to define trauma for you. I haven't yet, actually. I've talked about trauma, but I haven't defined it. And I'm still coming from the perspective that we're biopsychosocial creatures, and that disease, whether it takes the form of mental illness, addiction, or physical affliction, physical illness, originate in trauma. And I'm talking about cancer, I'm talking about rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, ALS, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, chronic asthma, psoriasis, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, any scleroderma, any chronic condition. I'm just going to deal with something here. Somebody read me a note saying about you can't oppose somebody when you're all alone, and this person says that we do that all the time, we oppose ourselves. I'm not getting into the dynamics of that. All I'm saying is that if somebody is opposing themselves, that is true, they're not going to be seen as oppositional. That may happen, that there's a conflict internally, but the external world would not see them as oppositional. So when I talk about oppositionality, being there, and even the person who opposes themselves, it reflects trauma. Because actually, what is trauma? So trauma is not what happens. Trauma is not the fact that you're sexually abused or beaten or your parents didn't listen to you. That's not trauma. Trauma is what happens. Trauma is not a tsunami. Trauma is not a war that you witnessed or suffered from. Trauma is what happens internally as a result of those external triggers. And the essence of trauma is really, the impacts, I already talked about them, brain, shame, emotional pain and all that. But the essence of it, and you'll hear this in this talk, is when you're traumatized, like let's say I was beaten in the parking lot of this hotel. I might suffer physical injury and upset, but that doesn't mean I was traumatized. I would be traumatized only if, coming out of it, my future behavior was restricted. If I developed a more restricted, fearful view of the world. If I developed a more deficient sense of myself. If I couldn't be in the present moment because I was always somehow stuck in the fear and pain of the past, then I'd be traumatized. So trauma, essentially, is an inability to be fully present, but to be restricted by under the impact of the past. I'm not talking about learning from the past. We all have to learn. I'm talking about actually being restricted by it. So once you're traumatized, your range of responses to the world narrow. And the more traumatized you are, the more stereotypical, the more programmed, the more automatic your reactions are. To the point where almost like an enemy,
still
when you touch
about 13 minutes left here. I'm going to zoom in on her face and do a little detailing of her pupils and nostrils and some slight blacks around the hair to start up some feature definition.
That's what trauma is. And the other aspect of trauma is a disconnection from the self. And how that shows up, I'll be talking about just now. But disconnection from the self is not a vague, romanticized notion of the self. It literally means a disconnection. So let me ask you this question now. I'll ask it again later. But how many of you had the experience of having a strong gut feeling about something and ignoring it and then being sorry afterwards? Raise your hand if you've had that experience. Okay. Now, when I say disconnect from the self, I'm talking about the gut feelings. Because you remember I mentioned evolution, how it begins over there and brings us to the present time, an inch away from that wall over there. Out there in nature, how long would you survive if you're not connected to your gut feelings? So that not listening to it, the ignoring it, or the denying it, or worse, not even feeling it, that's trauma. That's a disconnection from the self on a very deep physiological level. So, in 20 years of family practice and 7 years of palliative care work, I should say it was 27 years of family practice, along with 7 years of palliative care work, I found that people who got sick or who didn't wasn't random. That the people who developed illness had certain features. And as a family physician, and by the way, somebody asked me today, how do you deal with all the suffering in the world of addiction and not go home and be depleted by that? That's what they call compassion fatigue. And I'm going to suggest to you that there's no such thing as compassion fatigue. Nobody ever gets fatigued by being compassionate. So what we call compassion fatigue represents something else. And it's that something else that I'm talking about right now. The most dramatic manifestation of that something else that I'm talking about is physical illness. As a family physician, of course, you have a privilege that the specialist doesn't have, because you get to know people before they're sick. You also get to see their family backgrounds. Especially because once they see somebody, they're already ill. She's got no idea what this patient was like, or what the patterns were in their lives. They're not trained to ask these questions. I mean, let's just do a check here. How many of you been to a medical specialist of any kind in the last 5 years? Any kind, I don't care. Okay, now, thank you. Now raise your hand if the cardiologist, respirologist, neurologist, gastroenterologist, dermatologist, any kind of ologist, ask you anything about your childhood emotional experience. Just raise your hand. Okay? Look around. How many of you asked if you're ever traumatized? How many of you were asked about what your present relationships are like with your family or spouses? Now we're getting a few more, but just a few more. These are determinant factors in your illness. How many of you were asked how you feel about yourself as a person? 3, 4, 5 people. These are the determinant factors. So before I explain why or how that works, and I'll give you the science behind it, at least I'll touch upon the science behind it, I'll read you some newspaper clippings. The first one was written by a woman. This is from the Globe and Mail. This is Canada's most this is written by a woman who was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she's describing her diagnosis, depicting it in this first-person article. Harold is the name of her doctor. Her husband's name is Hy. And Hy's first wife died of breast cancer. Now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. Which incidentally is not accidental at all. It has to do with the kind of women Hy is attracted to. And what kind of woman is that? This is Donna writing. Harold tells me that the lump is small, and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hy's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die here, he assures me. But I'm worried about Hy. I won't have the strength to support him, I say. No. What's wrong with this picture? She's diagnosed with a potentially fatal illness. She might have to undergo radiation, surgery, chemotherapy, and her first thought is, how will I support him? So this automatic regard for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own is a major risk factor for illness. For physiological reasons, I will explain. The next three clippings are actually obituaries, which are very interesting because you've heard the expression, the good die young. They do. Many of you are breathing a sigh of relief right now, I'm sure. And there's a reason for it. So this is a physician who died at age 55 of cancer in Toronto. Never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Toronto Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. If a friend who was diagnosed with cancer, is that the advice you give them? Just don't worry about yourself, don't take a moment to reflect, rest, de-stress, just keep going back to work until you drop. So this rigid and compulsive identification with duty, role, and responsibility is another risk factor for illness. The next one, another obituary of a woman who died at age 55 again of cancer.
Alright, that gets a little more detail and definition in the features. Still needs a lot of work,
and
but
pictures are very interesting because
that's getting there for first layer of lights and darks. Not bad.
About the person who died, but also about what we value in the other person.
Watch these out.
And what we value is very often what kills them. So, this is Naomi. In her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The worst she could say was fooey or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. Now, I'm sure that many of you who are in long-term relationships...
Alright. So that starts balancing it out some, as far as the background and the foreground, and giving her some more definition, and at once keeping the facture and rhythm of the initial brushstrokes through her and behind her. So that's kind of what we're going for, and I'm going to integrate. Well, it's got a long ways to go. I'm going to aura her after she's layered in much more and a little more defined. And then the aura will be rippling into wave-ish patterning that's going to be coming out of this blue and sandy sort of impression of the ocean. And then the background will probably work that sort of effect into it somewhat too, maybe radiating around the sun. I'm not sure, just kind of evolving it as it feels like needs to be done. So that's it for the moment. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Oceanic. Thank you, and have a good day, Earth.